Good evening. I am Sam Brown, president of your Knoxville branch for the NAACP and your host for this evening's show. We're so glad to have a very rich panel with us today who will discuss the importance and the impact of the civil rights movement, particularly Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the realization of the dream that was foretold to us by the Rev Dr Martin Luther King Jr., one of our greatest leaders here in the movement in the United States of America and the world. We're so glad to have with us tonight the Rev Dr Harold Middlebrook, renowned freedom fighter, a retired pastor here in the city of Knoxville, and the dean, a man of pastors here in the city of Knoxville. We're also glad to have Reverend Renee Kesler, Executive Director and CEO for the Beck Cultural Exchange Center, and also Miss LaKenya Middlebrook, our newly appointed Director of Community Safety for the city of Knoxville. We're so glad to have you all with us today and looking forward to a very thought-provoking conversation. We're just going to go ahead and get right into the discussion. As we talk about the quest for freedom and civil rights in this nation, particularly that has been an ongoing and evolving process, beginning with emancipation, the Reconstruction Amendments, and then a century later, our people continuing to have to fight in the civil rights movement. I would like to begin with this question with you, Dr. Middlebrook, as someone who is a veteran in this fight, who has been fighting to secure the rights that many of us are able to enjoy and live freely because of today. How does it make you feel when you see many of those hopes and dreams of those freedom fighters realized in persons like Reverend Kesler, in persons like Ms. Middlebrook, and in persons like myself, but then also how that is now a fight that is reemerging now that we have this filibuster in the Senate and that is blocking the John Lewis voting rights bill? How did we get to this point after you all fought so hard to secure those rights for us and really awaken the consciousness of a nation?
Thank you. Let me say that first. The passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and consequently the 1965 Voting Rights Act helped us to realize that we were on the right track with the nonviolent demonstrations and with the cause. People before us and people in my age remembered and understood what it was like to not be able, to get on a Greyhound bus or any bus, and the sign in the bus in the front of it read, "Whites, seat forward, back." And then the back of the bus, it said, "Coloreds, seat from the rear forward." We knew what it meant to go to a water fountain that said "white only." In stores, there were 2 restrooms. Some stores were kind enough to have 3 restrooms. It said white men, white women, colored. And you had to knock on the door to see, on the door that said colored, you had to knock on the door to be sure what sex was in there and then put somebody to guard the door. We understood all of these atrocities. We understood what it meant when somebody said to you, "Boy, move." And so the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, in fact, said to America and said to African Americans, people of color, we are moving toward a state where we hope to be one, where we hope to be community, where we are striving for that community relationship. And so it is a joy to me when I've been fortunate enough, thanks be to God, to live to see Barack Obama become president, to see Renee Kesler, to see LaKenya Middlebrook, to see all of you achieving these levels that we were fighting for, because before the passage of the 64 Act, we didn't anticipate. We kept saying, God's going to send us a deliverer. God is going to set us free. Now, what disturbs me now is I've rereading Martin Luther King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? And I was really hoping that we were moving toward community. But it seems to me that where we are now, we are again becoming a chaotic nation, a nation split, a nation divided, a nation where people are really against each other and against people of color in particular, because they are afraid of losing control and of losing the ability to make all of the decisions. And we have to say, yes, sir, or no, sir, all over again. And so I'm delighted on one side, and then I'm disturbed on the other side, because I'm really hoping that we're moving toward being able to see a nation where all people of all colors are judged by the content of their character and not by the texture of their hair. Of course, when you look at me, you don't have to worry about figuring that out. Awesome.
Yes. Thank you so much, Reverend Middlebrook. And Reverend Kesler, moving on to you, when we talk about the stories and the narrative surrounding the plight of our people in this nation, and we see now there is a very aggressive effort to, I won't even say change the narrative, but just to conceal it, to make sure that persons are not fully aware of the struggles that persons like Dr. Middlebrook made, so that we, all of us, not just Black people, let's make it very clear, everyone has benefited from the rights and the immunities that we have secured, which originally are guaranteed to us by the Constitution, but we had to fight to make sure that those were given to us. So now that we have persons like so many of our freedom fighters, C.T. Vivian, John Lewis, who have been called to rest, how important is it for us to protect the truth of that story and to make sure that institutions like the BEC, and we fight to make sure the curriculum in our public schools is not changed, so that all people will be exposed to the light of truth?
Well, that's a great question, and thank you so much. We're going to tell the story. And whether you want to hear the narrative of the story or not, it will not be concealed. As you put it here at the BEC, we will reveal the greatness of those of us who have been in history. And I certainly don't feel, worthy to be on the panel with Dr. Middlebrook. I think that's not fair. So I thank God for allowing me the privilege to share space with him and those like him who have fought. Because really, when we think about the movement, when we think about what these people did, like Dr. Middlebrook, it overwhelms my heart. Literally during this time of the year with Dr. King, the birthday and the celebration and the commemoration of the legacy of Dr. King. And I always like to keep that in perspective because the man does not want to be honored, nor did he want to be honored while he lived. And I can't imagine he would want that even today. But the legacy, right, of all of the people who labored to do something greater than self, I listen to, like Dr. King, like Dr. Middlebrook said, I listen to Dr. King's voices, I listen to speeches, I reread things during this season of the year. And I'll be honest with you, my heart gets heavy. Because sometimes I think we forget how real it was, how seriously dangerous these young people, Dr. Middlebrook's got a little seasoning on him now, but these were young people who were literally on the front line. And so going back and listening and watching, I think that's imperative. I think we put it in context. And when I say going back, I like Dewey, my good friend Dewey Roberts always says, He heard, don't go back and look at the movement, with the Kumbaya music playing in the background, because you might get the impression that you're making a video and it was a sweet thing. But it was a horrifying thing, and it was demoralizing, and it was inhumane. And it was all of those things that indeed have been endemic of many African Americans since the founding of this country, in terms of how we are treated less than and what that looked like. So I just want to affirm that first. But then to get back to your question, which I think was, how do we reveal these stories? How do we ensure that we're not concealing these stories? Because even now, you mentioned, when we talk about the critical race theory and all of those things where we can talk to students or about history or not, then we enter into this conversation. And then I think where we are at Beck is we're going to tell truth. Truth must be told. Yeah. I tell people all the time, history is not about Black history, white history, American history, U.S. history, Asian history. It's just history. But unfortunately, we don't tell the whole story. We only tell pieces of the story. And until we get to the place where we can tell the whole story, then we have to keep segmenting out these parts, because Beck is going to tell Black history. But to be fair, and I say this to all of my white brothers and sisters, my Black brothers and sisters, my brothers and sisters of color all over, when you come to the Beck, if we don't tell you Black history and culture and incorporate other people into it, we too didn't tell the whole story, because it is about telling the entire truth about what happened and who were there and how it happened. So in terms of how we will do that for school-age children, we will comply with the law, because people like Dr. Middlebrook and all of these others lay their lives on the line, not to break the law, but to make the law. So if there is an issue with how we tell history and how it's done, then we need to deal with the law. And I think that's what Brother Lewis was saying, is that's where you do the fight. That's where the teeth is. And so I think that's where the fight continues. And I want to just stop because I don't want to be overwhelming, but I do want to say this. I mentioned that Dr. Middlebrook was a young man when all of this was happening. And indeed, it was young people who were leading the movement. It was young people. And I think we can't miss that. So today, when we look at Black Lives Matters and all of these other groups, it's young people, yourselves included, who are leading this movement, and we're following. And I remember Mr. Booker saying to me in Knoxville when he did the movement, they were leading, and the parents were saying to them, "Yeah, this is dangerous." And of course, Knoxville is nothing like Mississippi, Alabama, some of these other places. But they said, "This is dangerous. You kids need to get back in school." These are Knoxville college students. Y'all need to go back to school. It's dangerous. But the kids, and maybe as young people, we don't have the fear that we should have, or that we get later in life when we've lived a little bit. We're a little more outgoing in that era. But these were young students. And what happened was, at that summer of 61 here in Knoxville, they began to lead the movement, but they incited the next generations, their parents, to pick up the mantra and keep going. So even when they went back home to their communities, it was older African Americans and Black people and white people who came out to continue the fight. But it was the young people who incited it, who stood in the front lines of it. So I applaud young people who have that kind of courage, both then and now. And I'm a great follower. So I love watching you guys lead.
Awesome. Amen. And to Miss Middlebrook, when we look at who you are and everything you represent, a graduate of the University of Kentucky, a fancy law degree from the University of Tennessee, the first African-American to chair the Knox County Democratic Party, and now in your role as the first director for community safety, one would say, what are we continuing to fight for? Through LaKenya Middlebrook, she is the epitomization of that you all have arrived. Isn't it time for us to sit back and relax? So I just want to hear from you, someone who is very actively engaged in the fight. What would you say to that?
Well, first and foremost, thank you for having me on and for allowing me to be a part of such a distinguished panel and to talk with folks that I am inspired by and learn from, and am strengthened from. And so I am honored to be here with you all and appreciate all that each of you bring to our community, and to these conversations and to the fight for freedom and justice. And so for me, I think it's important that we continue to reiterate that freedom and equity and equality and justice and unity are not destinations, right? And so we are at a point on the journey. And there, and to the points of Pastor Middlebrook and Reverend Kesler, that it's important for us to always be able to remember how this journey has evolved and all the stops along the way and all the steps along the way, because if we don't, what we will find is that we're circling back, right? That we're going in a circle and we're not continuing to move forward. And so I am especially grateful that I am able to benefit. I've been able to sit at a place that allows me to see firsthand and hear firsthand, not just, I do read a lot and I listen and I watch and observe, but to be exposed to people who lived the journey that brought us to this point. And to be in a place where, I am fortunate and blessed that because of the struggle and the fight of our civil rights generation and folks like Pastor Middlebrook and Dr. King and C.T. Vivian and all of the great foot soldiers whose names we will never know, right? I am in a point where it has not ever occurred to me that I should not be in these spaces. But they did give me the wisdom to know that there are a whole bunch of people who think I'm not supposed to be in these spaces. So when I'm there, I have to be aware that not everybody wants me here or thinks that I deserve to be here. And that is their problem. So I have to operate in that space. But, I think one of the things that, and kind of to the questions that you asked the Reverend Kesler and Dr. Middlebrook, I was watching, I don't even know at what point during the last year and a half, 2 years it was, because there's just been so much, with the pandemic and all that we see and the disparities in that. And, as folks called it, kind of the racial reckoning, which is a conversation for a different day. But, and then looking at what we are experiencing around voting access and voting rights and suppression of votes and all of that just kind of exploding. And I remember watching television one day and I just felt so, to use Reverend Kesler's word, heavy. And it was heavy in a way that I couldn't put my finger on it. I just had to sit in it. And what I realized was that I was grieving. And I was grieving because what I was watching took me immediately back, as Dr. Middlebrook was saying, and rereading, where do we go from here? You read that and you realize that we have come a long way, but so many of those things seem very present and we're still doing it. And I thought about my father and the people that his colleagues and contemporaries and all that they sacrificed to get us to this point, and we're still here. And for a minute, I thought I was grieving for him, which just in his generation, which to some degree I was. But and for a split second, I thought I was grieving for myself. But then I realized that in that moment, I thought ahead to my great nieces and nephews who are school-age children. And the thought that if we are still doing this 50 years after my daddy did it, that 50 years from now, 20 years from now, those babies that we sacrificed so much for and love so much are going to be doing and experiencing the same thing. And I grieve for what they will go through. And I think we have to I think that's why it's so important to have these conversations, because if we don't continue to fight forward, then we're just going to keep on in this circle, and we're going to hear, Supreme Court justices and Congress folks say things like, well, we don't need this anymore because, as you can see, it has worked, because they are viewing things as a destination. And we have to say, no, it's a journey. And we're not going to undo the tools that are getting us to where we are. I'm not going to take the engine out while I'm still driving.
Awesome. Dr. King. Yes, sir.
Brown,
yes.
Let me piggyback for just a second on something.
Please.
That Ms. Middlebrook said. For years, part of our speeches have said that people need to know their history. If you don't know where you came from, you can't appreciate where you are, and you have no sense of direction for where you're going. If you don't understand where you've come from, you won't know when you're there, when you get there. Because the struggle will not have given you the understanding of how you got there.
Wow.
And the struggle is continuing. The struggle is continuing when we are having to fight all over again to have the right to vote, to have the right to participate in government. And we're going they're attempting to go even further back now, because they're even saying that if you vote, that they're going to put people in place who can negate your vote, who can nullify your vote, who can say that ain't what you meant to do, which says that we don't have sense enough to decide who's going to be our representatives and who are going to be the people who speak for us. And so the celebration around the birth of Dr. King in 2022 carries an even greater burden and challenge than it did in 2019, because we see anew that the struggle starts all over again. And I'm wondering how a man can write a bill, and because he can't get opposing party members to support his bill, he then tries to negate his own bill and won't even stand for the passage of his own bill. And so it seems to me that Martin was absolutely right. We are losing a sense of morality.
Yes.
We are losing a sense of our who-ness and our whose-ness. And we're going back to where we were even before the sit-ins of the 50s and the 60s.
Yes.
We need our history.
Yes.
We do. Before we wrap up, and I want to ask for some final thoughts from everyone, Dr. King mentioned in his writings, he's quoted to say that the universe bends towards justice. And a lot of times people, we misinterpret that to think that when he talks about the universe, he means in some way the tenets of our government bends towards justice. And I want to say that I don't really think that's the case. I think our country by design, unfortunately, bends towards bigotry and racism because it's so deeply embedded into the foundation of this nation. So how can we as individuals, and I want each of you to give us about 60 seconds because we've got about 3 minutes left. How can we, within our various spheres of influence, where we sit, where we have been able, the spaces we have been able to have access to, continue to push our government, our society, our communities to be further aligned with the tenets of justice, equality, and equity. We'll start with you, Rev Kesler.
Sure. 60 seconds. I think for me here in the back, my lane is to tell history. I think Dr. Middlebrook talked about not knowing the history and repeating some of that. As important as knowing the history so that we're not repeating some of the horrors of yesterday is knowing the history so we are repeating some of the great things of yesterday. Because there were great things that we did in history that have been erased and eroded and gone away. So I think for me, my lane today, God has called me, first of all, as a minister of the gospel, to preach the gospel, the good news to those people. And within that is to tell truth. And truth is telling the whole story of history, because my hope is that by educating and informing and enlightening generations, that we will begin to make better decisions toward justice and equality for all people.
Thank you. Ms. Middlebrook?
Yeah, I think that Reverend Kesler is exactly right. It's about elevating truth in all spaces. And so, in the lanes in which we sit, in the spaces in which we have been able to gain access, that we are able to operate without fear. And that we are able to elevate the voices of those who may not ever be able to gain access to those spaces, but then also that we are educating our brothers and sisters, our community members across all spectrums of how these issues impact our lives. And organizing is so critically important, organizing folks to take a stand and take action, because it does have to be it has to be changed at every level, right? There has to be policy that drops this change. There has to be a moral adjustment. And so I think it takes all of us to work in all of those spaces, but to do so from a place of truth and making sure that we are elevating truth at all times.
Awesome. Thank you. Dr. Middlebrook, would you give us your final thought?
Yes. I'm very appreciative of the statements made by Reverend Kesler and by Ms. Middlebrook. They are absolutely correct. I want to say to us that as we strive and as the struggle continues and we reach levels that we were not in before, it is important for us to remember the struggle is not over. Mm-hmm. Don't think that because you are in a position that the struggle is over. It means that you got to continue the struggle. So when you get invited to lunch and you are the only one in the room that looks like me, don't get excited. If you're the only one after 2 years, you better knock out a window and holler, help, because the movement is not going forward. At that point, we all must strive continually so that we don't lose the ground that we have already accomplished. I don't plan to go back. I'm too old to go back. I don't know how to go back. I must go forward, for the struggle says to me, the prize is yet to be won.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much. And to our viewers, we hope you enjoyed. To our panelists, thank you so much for your time, and best wishes and good luck on all of your future freedom endeavors.